Welcome to Shadow of Truth with Dave Kranzler and Rory Hall. Today is Monday, February the 23rd, 2015, and this is the end of the war dollar. And here we go. Well, all right, Dave, I hope you had a good weekend, and it seems like there was a couple of things that happened in the last 48 hours or so that we need to address, and one of them, and I know this is at the top of your list. How's your day going so far?
It's okay, except for the extreme market manipulation that's going on right now. How about you?
I'm doing all right. I know that Zero Hedge released an article on Saturday that de-dollarization and Russia ratifies the $100 billion BRICS Bank. And why don't you tell us about that?
Yes, and well, actually, a couple days earlier from that, as everyone who's listening to this knows, Russia's been developing an alternative to the SWIFT system, because the SWIFT system, which is the electronic banking clearing system that is used to clear all global trade using the dollar, is the system by which the U.S. inflicts financial terrorism and financial war on countries that it has disagreements with. The most recent being Iran.
Yes.
And the U.S. has repeatedly threatened to boot Russia out of the SWIFT system. Well, as it turns out, all along, Russia's been developing an alternative to the SWIFT system. And everyone knows it was going through beta testing. And I think the original rollout date was for this summer. Well, as it turns out, Russia rolled it out and went live last week. And the significance of this is that it's going to give the entire world an alternative to using the dollar for trade clearing.
It's negative for us here in the States, but it's very positive for the rest of the world.
Well, I'd be careful there. It's not negative for us in the United States because it's going to take power away from the U.S. government. The U.S. government uses its dollar reserve status to inflict financial terrorism on everyone in the world, including everyone listening to this show. I mean, we've had nothing but about 20 years of financial repression, and it's gotten worse ever since QE started. Now, if you take away that toy from the U.S. government, it removes the foundation of the U.S. government's power.
That's true.
And so, in fact, it will actually improve our lives in the long run if we don't end up in a world war over this, which is probably where it's headed.
I would say yes.
And then as a follow-up to the SWIFT system, which that's huge, and it's not getting any coverage in the U.S. media, of course, because of the significance of it. It's basically Russia's latest attempt, and they're supported by China on this and probably most of the rest of the world. It's the latest attempt to dislodge the dollar's reserve status. And that's a whole process that's going to take time, but Russia just accelerated the process. And then secondarily, the Russian parliament or Russian government approved the funding of the BRIC Development Bank.
Yes.
And that's going to be a direct competitor to the World Bank, which is controlled by the United States and the Bilderbergs, and the IMF, which is obviously controlled by the United States. And so both of those actions combined are a huge body blow to the U.S. government's ability to use the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency and use it as basically a financial weapon against the rest of the world.
And when the SWIFT system, when it was launched, I think there was like 90 plus institutions that were going live with the opening of that. I think it was like 90, it was either 93 or 96.
I didn't see the number, but that doesn't surprise me. I mean, it's no secret that Russia and China and Russia and several other countries are already conducting their trade, or a fair amount of their trade, in their respective currencies. But this basically puts a system in place that's going to prevent the U.S. from saying, okay, Russia, you're out of the SWIFT system, which would prevent Russia from conducting trade. Well, now they have a way around that now. Now, what I would offer up to everyone listening to this show is that this is the real reason that the United States is escalating its military conflict with Russia. It has nothing to do with any of the politics that you see bandied about Fox News and CNN and the highly misleading and highly controlled U.S. Western media. And it has everything to do with the fact that the U.S. or that Russia is making an attempt, and I'm guaranteeing you they have the full support of China with this, making the attempt at taking away the reserve status of the dollar and destroying the petrodollar, because that will take away the U.S. government's power and it will level the economic playing field for the whole world. I mean, ever since Bretton Woods back in 1947, the U.S. has had a distinct advantage over the rest of the world in every aspect of finance and economics and trade. And the dollar reserve status is the reason why the U.S. has been able to issue all this debt. If you look at a graph of the amount of debt that's been incurred in this country since Nixon closed the gold window, it went up at basically a 45-degree angle from 1971 on, and it's gone parabolic in the last 10 years.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, as long as we don't end up in World War III, this is going to be a good thing.
Well, I don't see how we're going to be able to avoid World War III. And I wanted to ask you something, Dave, or I wanted to make a comment about China. You've mentioned China being, basically a partner to Russia in this whole process, and they obviously are with the BRICS Development Bank. And as we all know, China has been going around the world creating direct currency swaps with 25 or more countries, and not small economies. I mean, we're talking about Australia and Japan and France and several other large, first world economies. And how do you see this being part of the SWIFT system and furthering the damage that it's doing to the war dollar? People refer to it as the petrodollar. It's actually the war dollar because it's backed by war. It's all about the military. If it wasn't for the military, there wouldn't be a dollar. And if you don't believe me, just ask Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi. So, but what are your thoughts on that?
It's known as gunboat diplomacy.
Gunboat diplomacy.
It's actually a term we learned in high school.
But how do you see as far as China working these different direct currency swaps?
Well, it's the same thing. It's just another way of going around using the U.S. dollar as the trade settlement mechanism and using the SWIFT system as the trade settlement mechanism.
But why don't we go after China the way we've gone after Russia?
Because China has a much bigger financial weapon than Russia does. Russia has about 120 billion in U.S. Treasury holdings. China has 1.2 trillion in U.S. Treasury holdings.
And I believe that Russia, in this whole process, dumped about 20% of their holdings.
They've been making no secret that they've been unloading their treasuries, which ironically they were selling treasuries at a time when it was rumored that they were selling gold, when in fact they were buying gold and selling treasuries. Now, as far as China goes, piling hard assets, and specifically and especially physical gold. And I'm sure everyone's been wondering, how, what, and why China's been accumulating so much gold. And of course, we're not going to know how much they do until they roll out a new currency system. But my view on it has been that they're accumulating gold. And by the way, their gold imports are up 17% year to date, year over year.
That's significant.
Yes. But my view on this is they know that they can't unload all of their treasuries without trashing the market. And so they're accumulating gold, et cetera, as a hedge against the time when the dollar plummets and those treasuries become worthless. And part of the reason why they don't want to unload those treasuries is right now with the U.S. manipulating gold and silver the way they are, it's giving China a huge window to accumulate as much cheap gold as they can.
And they can just sell a handful of treasuries and buy a handful of gold in its place.
They're buying more than a handful of gold.
Well, I understand that, but
yeah. Now, what most people probably aren't aware of is that when the U.S. rolled out the Operation, what was that called? Operation Twist. Remember Bernanke did Operation Twist? It was part of QE2.
Yes.
Okay. Well, at the same time, China also had a boatload of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac agency paper. So what happened there was China basically said, get us out of this paper. And the U.S. said, okay, but you need to swap it for treasuries. And for a while, China's treasuries holdings went up a bit. But what they did was they swapped out of all of that agency paper and bought treasuries. And that's what helped the Fed conduct the Operation Twist operation. Because the Fed was selling short-term treasuries that it had accumulated in QE1 and was buying longer-term treasuries, which was the twist part, and basically allowed them to push the yield at the longer end of the curve down. But it also gave China a bid, or gave China supply to buy in order to do that swap where they sold agency paper into the Fed, and then the Fed passed along some of that intermediate term treasury paper into China.
So basically, China was able to get rid of their absolute toxic waste and trade it for merely radioactive waste.
Exactly. So the second item here is that I'm sure everyone's been watching the markets. Gold and silver popped up really nicely earlier this morning on the back of just horrific economic news. The Dallas Fed Manufacturing Index literally plunged. Existing home sales for January plunged. I think there was a few other pieces of economic information out that were very negative. And right after that news was released and absorbed by the market, the Fed went to work pushing up the S&P 500 and smacking the metals.
Well, that's what they do.
Yes, and this another just a completely artificial smack. And you have to wonder with India is ramping up its gold imports like crazy right now. Obviously, China's up 17% year to date. You have to wonder, where's all this supply coming from? Well, it's paper gold supply that's supplied on the COMEX, because these smacks primarily occur only when the COMEX is open and Asia is asleep. Asia is the physical metal bid in the market. And when they go to sleep and the COMEX opens, they can print up paper gold contracts and dump them on the market. And that's exactly what happened today.
Well, if China is up 17% year to date, and India has just relaxed their taxation, that's now confirmed, and the festival season is starting in India, I mean, they could be up 10+% by the time that the festival season ends. I mean, is that realistic? Or
I think India will be up more. But I mean, for me, what the point is I want to make here is that, I mean, the only thing the U.S. government has left right now is to keep the S&P 500 propped up and to smack the metals. And at some point, they're going to lose control of the metals. But it just gets to be irritating because this happens day after day, and it's completely artificial.
Well, unfortunately, we just have to live with it until we don't. I mean, and hopefully the time when we don't have to live with it is coming sooner than later. Because I'm sick of it as you are.
It's hard to pinpoint the timing on this, but I will say that, and the housing numbers out today confirm this, the seasonally adjusted annualized rate number that the National Association of Realtors vomits out every month showed only a 5% drop in home sales from December to January. But if you go into the report itself, they also show a section called the unadjusted monthly sales. December to January plunged over 30%, and it's the largest plunge from December to January that's occurred in the last 2 years, and actually by far. and it's the drop off in home sales that we're seeing is consistent with the same type of plunge that we've seen in the price of oil and in the Baltic Dry Index, and also in other commodities. And it points to the fact that the U.S. economy is really starting to collapse now. And that may be the actual sort of proverbial pulling the leg out from under the stool that takes away the U.S. government's ability to manipulate these markets, and it'll pull back the curtain and expose the wizard.
Like I said, I hope that it's more sooner than later.
I think it could happen this year, and it could happen by this summer. But again, I'm not going to put any time frame on it. Well, I'm still sticking by my call, though, that silver will be the best investment of 2015.
And I believe that with everything that you just said, in conjunction with the longshoremen's strike on the West Coast, with all that product being held up, the shelves are going to start running thin. They're going to have to. I mean, I know that once the strike ends, that product will flood into the market, but it's going to take a few weeks for it to start making its way from the West Coast into Middle America and to the East Coast. It's going to take a few weeks for that to happen. And that's going to exacerbate everything that you just said, right?
Well, it will, but again, that's a temporary effect.
I understand, but we're already broken. If something is already broken, if you've got a broken leg and you continue to walk on it, it's going to make it worse. And that's the way that I see it, is that the system is already broken. Things are, just like you said, we're witnessing the collapse. We're full bore into it. And if you don't see it, then I feel sorry for you. But these items that we've just talked about, the Russian SWIFT system, the BRICS Development Bank, the fact that China has been at least 2 years working on these direct currency swaps, the fact that the housing market has never recovered, the fact that we are in a jobless recovery, the fact that the United States government has been paying all of its bills with fictional money, with fictional digits on a screen that, I mean, even Greenspan recognized it. I mean, he said on television a couple of years ago, that the United States will always be able to pay its bills because it can simply print the money. Well, I think that all of those things are coming to a head, and with the fact that the shelves are getting ready to start running dry, and even though it will be temporary, and I believe that it's going to further expose the nightmare that is unfolding right in front of us.
And you left out the most important indicator of U.S. desperation: the continuous, nonstop repression of gold and silver prices using paper gold and silver. And that, when that blows up, it's going to really blow up badly in the government's face.
But that's not going to happen until China decides that it's going to happen.
Oh, I think it'll happen before that. And it'll happen in a way so that the U.S. can't point to China and blame it on them.
Well, yeah, I can buy that, because China doesn't want any fingers pointing at them. But now they have a scapegoat in Russia in unleashing the SWIFT system, because that is going to, as you pointed out, that's going to put a major, major hurting on the war dollar, period. So, but is there anything else that we need to touch on, Dave?
No, that's actually, we've talked about more than I expected, but it's all important stuff. And that kind of wraps it up for me today.
Well, all right. Well, we'll unless something blows up later this afternoon or in the morning, I will talk with you sometime the next day or so.
That sounds great, Rory.
All right, buddy. Have a good one.
You too.